A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions, so I made a tutorial. Alright guys, so today we're going to learn how to make exactly what you just saw, and we're primarily focusing on these captions here, these dynamic captions. There's a lot going on, and you can make them as simple or as complicated as you would like. I highly encourage you to play around and find something that is unique to you. But I'm going to show you what goes into this and break it down step by step. And I'm also going to make sure when we create our new composition, we do this in social media format, because so often these videos are going on social media. So the first step obviously is just to make a new composition. So we're going to go to composition, new composition. And like I said, I want to make this for social media. I'm going to call this tutorial. And if you are familiar with the usual film ratios, we're typically working in 16:9, which is widescreen, but we're going to go exactly the reverse of that. We want 9:16. And in this case, because I have 4K footage, I can very comfortably edit with a 1080p by 1920 height sequence. Everything else looks good here. Obviously adjust to your specific project needs. And by the way, this whole example project is available for free. I'm just going to give it to you. So if you want to work alongside me and have this as a reference, I encourage you to download it. So now that we have our blank sequence here, the first step, really with any project, but particularly for this one, is to drag in all of our base materials, which in this case is our footage and our voiceover, which I recorded just moments before this. So I've already done most of what I need to get the audio sounding nice in Adobe Audition, but obviously this clip is not ideal. It's not color graded, it's not sized correctly, and I'm not even in the frame, so we're gonna fix this. So I'm gonna go ahead and click Control-Shift-D to cut that, delete the excess, and I'm gonna drag it out here to the end. Also, just so I don't start speaking right at the start of the video, I'm gonna go ahead and drag this voiceover out a little bit. And I think it ended somewhere around 6 seconds, somewhere within this range. So I'm gonna clip the end of our clip here, go ahead and delete that. And now we can set an out point by clicking N on our keyboard. And this is more or less our base sequence. My next step is just making this footage look decent. Usually there are more steps with this, but I kind of have it down pat as far as the LUT I like to use. So my first step is creating one adjustment layer. I'm just going to rename this and call this LUT. Keep that above the footage. We can go into our effects here and grab Lumetri and drag that onto our adjustment layer. And if we go into basic correction and browse our folders, we can find the LUT we want to use and it will automatically apply itself. Although we're not done, I have one more adjustment that you can use if you would like, and that is film grain. I find film grain is actually really nice when you're working with text like this, because it softens it up a bit and makes it blend into the footage a bit more. So all I'm going to do is go ahead and add a new adjustment layer, and we're going to name this grain. And this is the first and maybe only effect that actually costs money. I personally really like Film Convert. I think the grain looks fantastic, and it's essentially a plugin that I use on every single project. I'm going to go ahead and turn some of my film chroma down here just so I get some of that color and saturation back. It looks much better. Also, the grain, despite being Super 35, is quite strong, so I'm going to turn my strength down. Obviously, the alternative, the After Effects native version of this, is just the noise effect. Go ahead and drag that on and turn off Use Color Noise. I find looks a little better. You just drag that up to your liking and see what is a good fit. Again, we don't need it to be terribly strong, just enough to help blend out that text a bit. But I'm definitely going to stick with my Film Convert. So just for myself, I want to mark where I'm actually speaking here, so I have a visual of it in the timeline. We can go ahead and expand our voiceover by double-clicking L on the keyboard, and we'll see our waveform. So with the voiceover selected, I'm going to click the asterisk key, and that should leave a little marker here. And now we can go ahead to all these little points where we're speaking and just continue to set markers so we know where the action is taking place. Once that's done, we can go ahead and actually type out our captions. Now I want to see exactly what I say here, so I'm just going to leave a placeholder for now and make this say text, and then I'm going to scroll back and listen. A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So the first thing I say is, a lot of people ask me how I animate my captions, which is true. So now we have it written out, we can very easily center it by going to our Align tab here and just aligning horizontally, aligning vertically, and it's taking form. Now this isn't always the case, but it's often the case where with a video, no matter what font color you use, it will kind of naturally blend into certain parts. It's a little hard to read. So I'm going to add a very subtle drop shadow to this. Let's go ahead and drag that onto our text layer here. And I'm a huge fan of really subtle shadows, so I'm going to turn our opacity down to like 20. Make sure our distance is facing down and to the right, and just increase the distance by a hair, just a little bit. And that helps our eyes a bit with legibility. I also find just text in general is a little sharp, even with the film grain added. So I like to add just a little bit of Gaussian blur on top of the text layer, and it can be really subtle. I turn this to like 3% oftentimes. Even that actually looks a little strong. Let me do 2%. And it's a subtle difference, but when you actually put this under the grain tab, it's hard to see, but it does make a subtle difference and kind of blend the text in a bit. Now, if we wanted to, if that's all we wanted to do, we could just drag the ends of this to when we start speaking and stop speaking, chop that up. And to some degree, we have a caption here. I mean, it's kind of long for this purpose, but this is how it looks. But there's obviously more to do and there's more text to add, so I'm going to do that quickly. Just to speed this up, I'm going to duplicate this layer for the sake of creating the other captions. So I'm just going to write so with a comma. And we can go ahead and align that again, get that centered. And we'll duplicate this once more so we can add the last bit. I made a tutorial, where I say I made a tutorial. So you can just type that in. So again, if we watch that back, we kind of have basic captions in place. A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So I made a tutorial. And I don't do this with every video, but I want to do it in this one because I think it looks good. I'll even drag this text under the actual LUT itself, and we can make adjustments to the color, and this will, I don't know, it just kind of matches the look of the scene a bit better. I really like this softer color. And to be honest, it kind of already looks decent, so I might just leave this here. Sometimes I have to make some adjustments though. The first thing I like to do is grab all my text layers here and turn on motion blur. So when you click this, whenever anything moves on that layer, it will have a natural motion blur to it. This is really helpful that they have this here now, because I remember the only way you could get this was by using RSMB, Real Smart Motion Blur, which can be pretty taxing. So to start animating our text, we want to hit this drop down here and find this little arrow where it says animate. And I like to use two things. I like to use position, and click it again, and opacity. And basically what we're telling the animator is that we want it to end up in this position, in this state, but we want it to start and animate from something else. So in this case, I like it when my text comes up, which means I need to tell the animator to start it further down. So I'm going to drag this down. Usually I find between 40 and like 70 pixels is nice and subtle. We'll just do around 50. And I want them to fade in a bit. So we're going to drag this opacity down to 0. And for now, our text has disappeared, but fear not. If you open your range selector and go to advanced, you'll find your text again by dragging this offset option left and right, and you'll see how it kind of starts to try and animate things. But to be honest, it looks like crap until we make a couple more adjustments. First things first, I changed the shape to ramp up. This is basically an automatic easy ease without having to do any crazy graph editing, which is really helpful. I usually set the ease high to 50% and the ease low to 100. And you can change this up. The higher you drag your ease high setting, the more snappy the movement will be, but I like it to be somewhere in between. Especially for longer captions, I like it to animate based not just on the characters themselves. So if you look here, I don't like it to go letter by letter, to be honest. I think it's a bit hard to read and keep up with. It makes a lot more sense as the text comes in to animate it based on words instead. So this way, it comes up word by word as opposed to letter by letter. I'm going to see where my text starts here and see where I stop saying this line of text. So let's see. I animate my captions. So, animate my captions. So I stopped talking around this point on the timeline, and I find usually the animator comes in a bit quicker than it says. Like usually all the text will be on screen by the time this offset hits like 70. As you can see, it's not really moving after 70. So I'll move it back a little bit further. I'll set the offset to 100 and keyframe that. And then I'll go to the very start and turn this offset all the way down to -100. And now as you can see, if we click playback, we have some really nice animation here with very minimal work. The main trick from here is just making sure the pacing of this animation lines up with when I'm actually saying the words. So let's see. A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So it comes in a little late. I say a lot before the words a lot actually come on screen. So to fix that, I'm just gonna drag our text forward a bit and move this keyframe back. And let's see how this looks.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
And surprisingly, this is already looking really nice. I think as far as this animator goes, we're done.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
To close this whole thing off and make it fly back off of screen, we can just go to the end of our text here and turn our offset back down, this keyframed offset, to 0. So you'll see just as soon as it comes up when I'm saying it, it disappears when it needs to go into another caption. I think this caption is done. On to the next. What I like to do is I'll line up here on the keyframe before our other caption starts to descend, and I'll drag my other caption out to that. What we can do is just go ahead and copy this whole animator over to this caption. So if you select animator 1 and click Control C, you can click Control V on your other caption, and it will have the animator on it now. Granted, the keyframes won't be quite right, so we can fix that. I'm gonna drag this out slightly to the end of the other caption when it disappears completely. And I'm gonna set that to 100, maybe just slightly out. Let's see the movement here. Yeah, this works. Let's see how that looks.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So I made a tutorial.
Nice, looks really solid. And we just keep doing this with all of our text. So I'm gonna add my endpoint here now and just see how that looks to begin with.
So I made a tutorial.
Drag this out. Copy our animator over to it with Control V, expand that, and frankly, let's just see how this looks to begin with.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So I made a tutorial.
So the timing isn't quite right, but we can fix that. This comes in a bit early. I'm gonna drag it back a bit.
So I made a tutorial.
I think the start point is actually fine. It just needs to come in much slower. So I'm gonna drag these out.
I made a tutorial.
Maybe it even needs to come in earlier. And just based off of the next effects we're gonna add, I want this to expand out to the very end of the sequence, so I'm gonna do that. And now we're left with this.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So I made a tutorial.
Looks really nice. Now there's one more effect I like to add just to spice up the captions a bit before we get into some of the movement that you saw earlier. And that is a handy little effect called Turbulent Displace. I'm gonna take that and drag that onto one of our captions here. And what Turbulent Displace does is it gives you this little wiggle on your text. A lot of people are familiar with this style, and I think it just looks really nice. And to get that effect, it's actually really simple. I find usually setting your amount and size to the same number, usually around like 15 or so, and you can even boost the complexity up a bit to like 1.5. You can start to see how that looks now, even though there's no movement. And to keyframe in that movement, we first want to go to our evolution options here, turn on cycle evolution, and just make this a really big number. Like I usually do 80, that should be plenty. And now we can go to the start of our text layer here before it actually flies in, and we'll set a keyframe on our evolution when it's at 0, and we'll go ahead to the end of the layer and turn this up to something like 30. And it's important you set this first number here because how this wheel works is when you spin it, it increases by degrees on this side, and then a full evolution is equal to 1 point on the left side. So you just want this to be at 30. There's a ton of evolutions happening over this 3-second period, and that gives us the movement that you saw before. And frankly, this is a little intense, so I might turn it down. Let's turn that way down to something like 15.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
I think it's a good start, but I think this size of the displace is actually a little large. I'm gonna turn my amount and size down to like 13.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
I like that. This is perfect. It's a subtle wiggle without making the text look like it's about to explode. And all you have to do from here to get this on all your other text is simply open up this dropdown, click on your effects, and highlight Turbulent Displace. Just click Control C. And that's going to copy all your keyframes. And so what you have to do, just go ahead to the very front of the next caption. That's important. Go to the very start, and just with that layer highlighted, click Control V and paste it. Now the wiggle is on the next caption, and you just keep going down the line. Control V. Now all of our captions have a nice little wiggle. And for someone who just wants static captions and doesn't want to mess with the footage too much, this is a good stopping point. I mean, this is really solid. It already stands out compared to what most people do. But, you know, we're going to go the extra mile and add some 3D spatial movement. So just for the sake of animating this all in, I'm going to go ahead and hide these layers for now by clicking the eyeball. And now we're just working with our actual footage. Right click, add a new camera, and I'm just gonna name it cam. We're going to also add a new null object. And it's very important that we make this a 3D layer by clicking this box here. And we're gonna parent the two together. So we're gonna drag our little wiggly on the camera layer and drag it over to the null layer like that. The next step is to set everything that we want to move with the camera to be a 3D layer. This includes our text. So I'm going to highlight our footage, I'm going to highlight our text, and we're going to turn them all into 3D layers with this box. Now, as you'll see, if we drop down this null and we go to transform, if we start to move our position here, it'll move the footage. And you can even do this by pushing in and out in 3D space, which is really cool. And there's a reason I use a null specifically instead of just a camera, because if you drop down your camera here and you start to mess with the position, you'll notice sometimes instead of just moving the camera side to side just because of the size of the 3D space, it'll start to have this weird rotating effect. I guess messing with the orientation is a little bit better, but even that is still funky. So by parenting it to a 3D null instead, we just get the camera moving along one plane, which in my opinion, at least for this project, is ideal. And my goal with creating any 3D movement in any project really is just to emphasize what is being said. So a lot of this is dependent on your voiceover. There's no precise way to do this, you just kind of have to build an eye for it, but you want to open up your null layer here and create your very first keyframe when you want the movement to start. So I'm going to click the keyframe. I'm going to move ahead in the sequence, maybe to around here, I don't know, just guessing. And I'm gonna push this way in. So it's a pretty dramatic movement.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
It looks blocky at the moment, but this is where the graph editor comes in. I'm gonna click this graph icon with the position selected here. And if your graph doesn't look like this, go here and just click edit speed value. I think this is ideal for a lot of 2D movement, which I know we're working in 3D right now, but with 2D objects. I'm gonna select both of these keyframes here, and I'm going to come over here and click the Easy Ease button. And now as you can see, the movement is a little smoother. Still, it could be far smoother and even more dramatic. So I'm just going to play with this. Usually I create a pattern that looks something like this, where you drag in each side.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
But it doesn't come in quite early enough, and I think it's a little too snappy for this application. So instead, I'm going to drag this back a bit and move this one forward.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my caption.
So it's still not coming in quite early enough, which tells me we have to move both of these keyframes together. We can just exit our graph editor by clicking it again and move these keyframes forward a bit.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
I think that looks fantastic. And in the original example, I did another really slight push in when I said so, just for emphasis. So if this marker is where we want the action, what I can do is go in front of it a bit and keyframe our position again. Then go behind it about the same amount here and push in a bit. So I'm gonna bring it in just slightly, not a ton. Then if we go back in our graph editor, I can select these keyframes, easy ease them, and use that first method I taught you where we pull each side in a bit.
How I animate my captions. So I made a...
I think that looks decent. I think it's a little too snappy, so I might drag these out from one another just a hair.
So I made...
And the timing isn't quite right. It's hard to tell, but it's a few frames too late, so I'm gonna move both of these forward. And now we'll keyframe our final movement, which is just the fly out. We already established this marker is where we want the movement to start, so I'm going to do that now. I'm gonna go ahead and keyframe a spot, go to the very end of the sequence, and pull this whole thing out as far as I possibly can without seeing black in the sequence. We're gonna move it back up a bit. Just like before, we can go ahead and select this, easy ease it, and pull these in. I wanted this fly out to honestly be more of a float out, which means increasing the duration a bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and move this keyframe that starts the movement a bit further back, quite a bit further back actually.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So I made a tutorial.
I think that's perfect. This movement is just about done. And there's another method here we can use to make the text movement itself more dynamic. Now, if we turn our captions back on by selecting them and turning the eyeball back, this is what that looks like.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So I made a tutorial.
Obviously, the sizing isn't quite right, and it doesn't look like our example here. If you remember this,
People ask me how I animate my captions, so I made a tutorial.
it looks so much more dynamic. So to make it more dynamic, what we want to do is select our first caption here. Go under Transform, and again, we turn this into a 3D layer. And we want to really drag this text forward in 3D space, because basically the closer something is to the camera, the more movement will be perceived by the viewer. So to do that, we're gonna drag this number back, which for some reason brings it forward. We're gonna do that quite a lot, actually, to the point where it's a little obnoxious. And what this is doing is just dragging the text way forward in 3D space compared to the footage behind it. And obviously the scaling isn't quite right, so we can now mess with the scale since the position is locked in and just turn that down. So what we've essentially done is created this illusion where the text is the same size, but it is far forward in 3D space and moves much more when the camera moves. I'm also gonna bring it down so it's more centered.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
So the parallax effect isn't as pronounced still, so I'm just gonna keep dragging this in forward space until we get what we want. And I'm also, of course, going to decrease the scale and drag it down a bit.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
That looks fantastic. It's a lot more obvious, still subtle, but obvious that the text is taking on this parallax effect. And now I'm just gonna do the same with all of our other captions. Just to get a good starting point and save time, we can actually copy our transform settings with Control-C and do the same like we did with the turbulent displace where we just paste it onto the other layers. Obviously now the text is a little high up and in some cases even just way out of frame, so we can fix this. I'm gonna open up the SO layer here, find my transform settings, and drag that position down so it's more center.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions, so I made a tutorial.
And since I don't want to have to pull this back in 3D space and sacrifice on our parallax effect, just as last time, I'm gonna go ahead and go to transform and turn the scale down instead and just center this up.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions, so I made a tutorial.
Now, believe it or not, I think the parallax effect here is a little too strong because the movement is enormous and the text flies way back into the screen and almost becomes hard to read. So if I want the text to remain large and move less, all I have to do is actually bring it closer to the footage in 3D space by making this number closer to 0. And I'm actually gonna scale it back up here.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions, so I made a tutorial.
So as you can see, we still get our parallax effect without sacrificing on the legibility of it when it gets super small at the end. And to be honest, I misjudged this scale. This is still way too close to the edge of frame.
I made a tutorial.
So as far as our movement goes, this is more or less the final product.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions, so I made a tutorial.
This last tip I have for you is kind of a bonus tip. It doesn't have to do with the movement of the text, but it just has to do with selling the movement as a part of the video. And this is including some really subtle sound effects. I typically use Epidemic Sound for this, but just because I wanted to make sure I was using free sound, something that was accessible to everyone, I went on freesound.org and found a few things. For some of the text movement, I found this kind of steampunk sounding wind-up toy thing. For one of the camera movements, I found this whip sound, which I promise we will make less cheesy. And for the music, I actually found this sound effect that I used in my last video, but it's just this kind of like Christopher Nolan violin synthetic sound. Pretty awesome, and it fit the vibe of that video at least, but I'm just gonna use it again. And you know, I think the key with adding any sound effects to your video isn't making them perfect, but keeping them subtle and just making it something that sounds good to you. Have some personality. A lot of the sound effects I use, like this steampunk, like cranking sound effect and all these other things, I'll just keep using throughout all my videos and it kind of becomes a part of my style. But so I'm gonna go ahead and drag this wind up toy sound effect in here and I'll show you how we're gonna use this. And I only need one of these, so I'm gonna Control-Shift-D to clip this and just delete everything else.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my cat.
I'm gonna go ahead and right click and go to time, stretch, and boost this up to something like 230 to really slow down the sound effect. I'm then gonna find when this text starts to fade up and align this.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions,
I think the sound effect is actually a little slow, so we're gonna go to time stretch, and just turn this down to like 200.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions.
And yeah, you know, it doesn't have a, I guess, specific reason for being here, but for me, it just kind of gives the text that's flying in a bit of texture and adds some interest. A lot of these things aren't even things that people really pay attention to, but it's just in the back of their mind, boosting the production value a bit, just giving things more texture. The next thing I wanted to do is to just, I don't know, again, add texture. And one way we can do that is by adding a sound effect for camera movements. So I'm now going to drag in my whip sound effect here. And I already know this is way too quick, but let's just hear what it sounds like.
So I made a tutorial.
I'm going to go to time, stretch, turn this way up to something like 400. And now it's slowed down the sound effect quite a bit. I think I still want it to have a deeper sound, so I'm going to boost this up to 500.
So I made a tutorial.
That's perfect pitch-wise, but I think it's just a little too loud. Like, it needs to be subtle. It's really important for sound effects to be subtle. So I'm gonna go to our audio settings here and open this up and just turn this down to like minus, I don't know, honestly like minus 10.
So I made a tutorial.
Honestly, I think that's perfect. And I'm not gonna spend too much time on music because this was about the captions after all, but I'd like to have it in here.
A lot of people ask me how I animate my captions. So I made a tutorial.
And yeah, there it is, guys. There's my full tutorial on how to animate captions in this really cool, high production value, dynamic style where things are moving in 3D space. And you can get really creative with this. Just keep adding different effects and changing up the settings and changing the speed of things. So yeah, that's all I got. Thanks for stopping by.